My name is Ethan Carter, and I'm 42 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened 2 years ago at Hitchcock Nature Center in the Low S Hills of Iowa. I came to that place looking for solitude, a break from the noise of the world, and maybe a way to escape the pieces of my life that were falling apart. What I found was something else entirely, something I still can't explain, but I know was real. It started with my RV, a 1998 Gulfstream I'd picked up after my divorce. I'd spent months fixing it up, replacing the old pipes, tuning the engine, and making it the kind of space I could live in comfortably for weeks at a time. That was the plan. To disappear for a while, recharge in nature, and prove to myself I could still thrive off the grid. Hitchcock Nature Center seemed perfect. Rolling hills, trails for miles, and barely anyone around. It was a little-known gem in western Iowa, tucked into the rugged terrain of the Low S Hills. I thought it would be peaceful. I was wrong. The first night at the park was quiet. I parked the RV at a remote campground, away from the few other visitors. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the prairie grass and the occasional cry of a coyote in the distance. I cooked a simple dinner, read a book under the dim glow of my lantern, and went to bed early. The next morning, I met Connor. He was about 30, full of energy, and introduced himself as a cryptid hunter. I'd never heard the term before, but he explained it with a grin, waving a camera drone and pointing at a sound recorder hanging from his belt. "I'm here to find the skinwalker," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I tried to brush him off, but Connor was persistent. He seemed fascinated by the fact that I was camping alone, and when he learned about my survival background, he asked me to join him on a hike to the Devil's Shelf, a rock formation deep in the hills. "You're into this kind of stuff, right?" he said. "Off the grid, rugged terrain, the real deal?" I wasn't interested. At least, not until Natalie showed up. She was a freelance journalist doing a piece on Connor's obsession with cryptids. She was skeptical, intelligent, and had this way of looking at you that made you feel like she could see right through your excuses. Between the two of them, they convinced me to come along. Not because I believed in skinwalkers, but because I didn't trust them not to get lost or hurt out there. The hike started innocently enough. We set off mid-morning, the sun climbing high over the rolling hills. Connor was in the lead, chattering excitedly about the myths surrounding skinwalkers and how the Navajo believed they were witches who could transform into animals. "They mimic people too," he said with a grin. "Voices, movements. It's how they lure you in." Natalie rolled her eyes. "It's folklore," she said. "A way to explain things that go bump in the night." I stayed quiet, focusing on the trail. The deeper we went, the more rugged and unfamiliar the terrain became. The hills seemed to close in around us, the trees growing denser, the air heavier. By noon, we'd lost the main path entirely, following a deer trail that Connor swore would lead us to the Devil's Shelf. That's when the first strange thing happened. Connor's drone, which he'd been using to map the area, crashed inexplicably. It fell from the sky with a crack, its blades mangled. Connor cursed, inspecting the damage. "That's weird," he muttered. "Battery was full." Natalie raised an eyebrow. "Maybe your skinwalker doesn't like technology." Connor laughed, but I could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes. As the day wore on, more things went wrong. The temperature dropped suddenly, the air taking on a chill that didn't match the sunny sky. Our GPS devices started acting up, showing us in places we knew we weren't. And then there were the tracks, animal prints at first, but as we followed them, they morphed into something else. Barefoot human prints, deep and deliberate, leading into the trees. "That's not normal," I said, breaking the silence. Connor's face lit up with excitement. "Proof," he said. We're close. But Natalie looked uneasy. For the first time, her confidence wavered. We pressed on, and by late afternoon we reached the Devil's Shelf, a jagged outcrop of rock overlooking a steep ravine. The place felt wrong. The wind was louder there, almost like it was whispering, and the trees around the clearing seemed unnaturally still. Connor set up his equipment while Natalie took notes, her hand trembling slightly. I wandered to the edge of the clearing, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw it. A figure crouched low among the trees. It looked like a coyote, but its proportions were all wrong. Its legs were too long, its movements too human. It was watching us. "Ethan," Connor called, snapping me out of it. "Check this out." I turned back to the group, but the figure was gone. Night fell fast in the hills, and we decided to camp at the Devil's Shelf, despite my protests. "It's the perfect spot," Connor argued. "No way am I leaving now." Reluctantly, I helped set up camp, keeping my flashlight close. The RV was miles away, and I didn't like the idea of being out here after dark. The fire we built felt small, its light barely penetrating the shadows. The first attack came just after midnight. We were sitting around the fire when the RV started shaking violently. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward it, Natalie close behind. Connor stayed by the fire, shouting something I couldn't make out. The RV's door was open, swinging wildly in the wind. Inside, everything was in disarray, drawers pulled out, supplies scattered. And there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. It was hunched, its features hidden in the darkness. But its eyes glowed, a sickly yellow light that made my stomach turn. It stepped toward me, and as it moved into the light, I saw its face. It was my face. I froze, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The creature grinned, its teeth too sharp, too many. Then it spoke, its voice a perfect imitation of mine. "Ethan, come closer!" Natalie screamed, and the thing lunged. I slammed the door shut, and we ran back to the fire where Connor was shouting incoherently. "It's out there!" I yelled. "We need to leave. Now!" But leaving wasn't an option. The RV wouldn't start, and the skinwalker was everywhere. It circled the camp, its voice echoing from the darkness, calling our names. Connor was the first to break. He ran into the trees shouting, "I see it! I see it!" We found him hours later, huddled at the base of a tree, muttering nonsense. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He wouldn't respond to us, wouldn't move. Natalie and I dragged him back to the camp, our fear growing with every step. The skinwalker was playing with us, wearing us down. It killed animals around the camp, leaving their mutilated bodies as warnings. It mimicked our voices, our movements, sowing distrust and confusion. By dawn, I was out of ideas. The ash from the fire was my last hope. I remembered reading somewhere that it could ward off evil spirits, so I gathered as much as I could, drawing a circle around me and Natalie. We sat inside, holding Connor between us, and waited. The skinwalker came just before sunrise. It circled the ash, testing it, its yellow eyes glowing in the dim light. It laughed, a horrible, guttural sound, and then, finally, it retreated. We made it back to the RV hours later, Connor barely conscious. The vehicle started this time, and we drove away without looking back. Connor never recovered. He disappeared a few months later, and part of me wonders if he went back to the hills. Natalie published her story, framing it as fiction, but I could see the fear in her eyes whenever she talked about it. As for me, I haven't been back to Hitchcock Nature Center. I sold the RV, moved to the city, and tried to forget. But some nights, when the wind is just right, I hear it, the whispering, the laughter. It hasn't left me, and I don't think it ever will. My name is Claire Whitaker. I'm 29 years old, and up until last week I prided myself on being fearless. I've explored abandoned hospitals, trekked through deserts, and even camped alone in bear country. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened at Goose Lake. I still don't know if I'm lucky to have escaped or cursed because I went there in the first place. It all started with a tip from one of my subscribers. I'm a travel vlogger, and my channel focuses on exploring offbeat places, especially ones with creepy or mysterious reputations. A viewer messaged me about Goose Lake, a small body of water tucked away near Clinton, Iowa, and its supposed haunting by the drowned maiden. According to local legend, a woman named Mary Abbott drowned there in the late 1800s under suspicious circumstances. Some say she was killed by a jealous lover. Others claim she lured people to their deaths. It sounded perfect for my next video. I arrived at Goose Lake on a chilly October afternoon. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the water, still and dark, mirrored the overcast sky. The place was eerily beautiful, exactly the kind of location my audience loved. The first person I met was a fisherman named Nathan. He was pulling his boat up onto the shore as I parked my RV. "You camping here?" he asked, squinting at me like I'd just told him I planned to swim with sharks. "Yeah, just for the night," I said, grabbing my camera gear. "I heard there's some cool history here." Nathan snorted. "History, sure, but not the kind you want to mess with." He told me about Mary Abbott's ghost, how people claimed to hear her crying or calling their names at night. "If you're smart, you'll leave before sunset," he added, shaking his head. I laughed it off. I've heard plenty of spooky stories over the years, and none of them ever scared me off. Besides, I had a video to make. I spent the afternoon exploring the lake's edge, filming the dense woods and the water's inky surface. It was peaceful enough, at least at first, but as I was flying my drone over the lake, it suddenly veered off course and crashed into the water. "Damn it," I muttered, wading in to retrieve it. The water was icy cold, and as I pulled the drone out, I glanced down at the surface. That's when I saw it. A fleeting reflection of a pale, distorted face staring up at me. I froze, my heart pounding. But when I looked again, the reflection was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was primed to see something spooky, wasn't I? Back in the RV, I checked the footage from the drone. Most of it was fine, until the last few seconds, where the camera captured a faint figure standing at the edge of the lake. It was too far away to make out details, but it sent a chill down my spine. As darkness fell, the lake took on an oppressive silence. No frogs croaking, no crickets chirping, just the sound of my own breathing. I cooked a quick dinner on the tiny RV stove, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, I heard it. A soft knock on the RV door. My stomach twisted. Who could be out here at this hour? I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the door. No one was there. I stepped outside, scanning the area. The beam of my flashlight caught something on the ground, wet footprints leading from the water to my RV. They were small, like a child's, and they ended abruptly at the door. A shiver ran down my spine, and I bolted back inside, locking the door behind me. By morning, the eerie events felt almost like a dream. Determined to shake off the fear, I drove into town to meet Maggie O'Connor, a local historian who ran a shop filled with books, antiques, and trinkets. Maggie was delighted to talk about Goose Lake. Mary Abbott was a tragic figure, she said, her hands clasped over a steaming cup of tea. She was engaged to a wealthy man, but when he discovered she'd been unfaithful, he drowned her in the lake. "Do you believe she haunts the place?" I asked, half joking. Maggie's expression darkened. "I do. Many people have seen her, heard her crying. Some say she tries to pull them into the water, as if she's still searching for her lover. or her revenge. Before I left, Maggie handed me a small iron charm. "For protection," she said. "Just in case." I returned to the lake, feeling more uneasy than I wanted to admit. As night fell, the air grew heavy, and an unnatural fog rolled in, obscuring the shoreline. Then the voices started. At first, they were faint, like whispers carried on the wind. But soon they grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but they were definitely calling my name. I stayed inside the RV, clutching the iron charm Maggie had given me. My camera sat on the table, still recording in case anything happened. Around 3 a.m., I saw her. She stood at the edge of the fog, her figure barely visible in the dim light of the moon. Her dress was tattered and dripping wet, her hair hanging in clumps around her pale face, and her eyes, empty and hollow, were fixed on me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She raised a hand, beckoning me to come closer. The whispers grew deafening, filling the air with an otherworldly hum. I don't know what possessed me to go outside. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was her voice, soft and pleading, calling my name. As I stepped closer to the lake, the fog thickened, wrapping around me like a shroud. The water lapped at the shore, dark and inviting. "Claire," she whispered, her voice a blend of sorrow and rage. She reached out to me, her cold, wet fingers brushing my arm. In that moment, I felt a wave of despair so overwhelming it nearly brought me to my knees. It was like drowning in grief. But then I remembered the charm. I gripped it tightly, its rough edges digging into my palm. The ghost recoiled, letting out a piercing scream that shattered the silence. I stumbled back, breaking free of the fog. I didn't stop running until I was in the driver's seat of my RV, tearing down the dirt road as fast as the vehicle could go. Later, when I reviewed the footage, I saw her again, her face appearing in the reflections of the lake, in the windows of my RV, even in the fog. She was always watching. I uploaded the video, and it went viral. People debated whether it was real or staged, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I would never, ever go back to Goose Lake. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear her voice calling my name. My name is Sam Barnes. I'm 32 years old, and I never thought a simple camping trip with friends would turn into the kind of nightmare that keeps you awake at night, staring into the shadows. But that's exactly what happened last October at Yellow River State Forest in Iowa. I'm telling you this because I want someone to believe me, because I'm not sure I even believe myself anymore. It started as an innocent plan. I was the one who suggested the trip, desperate to reconnect with my old high school friends after years apart. Tommy Vance, always the sarcastic skeptic, was the first to agree. He figured it would be fun to debunk every scary story we might tell around the fire. Lena Ruiz, the heart of our group, jumped at the idea too. She'd been burning out in her corporate job and needed a break. And then there was Daryl Miller, our wild card, who wouldn't miss an excuse to stir up trouble. We piled into Daryl's beat-up RV on a crisp Friday morning, the kind of day that smells like fallen leaves and wood smoke. The drive to Yellow River was filled with laughter and teasing, but the moment we parked at the remote campsite, something felt off. The campsite was quiet, almost too quiet. No birds sang, no crickets chirped. "This is nature's version of airplane mode," Tommy joked as we set up camp. The generator in the RV sputtered once and died, leaving us with flashlights and a campfire for light. We didn't care at first. We were here to rough it, after all. As the night settled in, a cold wind swept through the forest, carrying with it a faint whispering sound. Lena was the first to notice. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Tommy replied, smirking. Voices in the wind. Tommy rolled his eyes. Oh, come on, don't start with the ghost stories already. But I heard it too. A faint, almost melodic sound, like distant voices murmuring. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks. When we turned in for the night, things got stranger. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of footsteps outside the RV. They were slow, deliberate, circling the vehicle. I grabbed my flashlight and peeked through the window, but there was nothing there. Just the trees swaying in the moonlight. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, Lena's compass was missing and Daryl swore someone had taken his lighter. "You guys messing with me?" he asked, half joking. None of us admitted to it, and a weird tension settled over breakfast. We decided to hike one of the trails, hoping some fresh air would shake the unease. The forest felt even quieter than before, like it was holding its breath. Halfway through the hike, we came across a strange sight. Claw marks gouged deep into the trunk of a tree. "Cougar, maybe?" I suggested, though the marks were too high up. Lena ran her fingers over the grooves, her face pale. "These aren't from an animal," she said softly. Tommy snorted. "Don't tell me Bigfoot's out here too." But his humor didn't last long. As we continued, we found more signs. Animal bones arranged in strange patterns, feathers soaked in something dark and sticky. Even Tommy couldn't joke about that. That evening, back at camp, the wind returned, stronger now, and with it, the whispers. We huddled around the fire trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. Then Lena froze, staring into the darkness. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "See what?" I asked. There was something watching us. We all looked, but the firelight didn't reach far enough into the trees. Tommy laughed nervously. "Just your imagination," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The wind howled louder that night, and the whispers turned into something more sinister, laughter, faint and mocking. I lay awake in my sleeping bag, every muscle in my body tense. Around 3 a.m., Lena's voice jolted me upright. "Sam, help me!" It was coming from the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and bolted out of the RV, only to find Lena sitting by the dying embers of the fire. She looked at me, confused. "What's wrong?" she asked. "I heard you calling for me," I said, my heart racing. She shook her head. I didn't say anything. Daryl, who had been snoring moments ago, groggily joined us. "What's going on?" Before I could answer, a piercing scream echoed through the forest. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something in between. A sound that froze my blood and sent us all scrambling back into the RV. By morning, Daryl was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, his boots and jacket missing. We found claw marks on the RV door, along with bloody smears. Tommy tried to stay logical. "Maybe he went for a walk and got lost," he said, though his voice shook. "He wouldn't leave without telling us," I said. Lena was silent, her eyes darting nervously to the tree line. "It took him," she finally whispered. "Whatever's out there. It took him." We searched the area, calling Daryl's name, but all we found was his lighter lying in the dirt. By nightfall, we were trapped. The RV was our only sanctuary, but the generator was dead, and the thing outside was growing bolder. It mimicked our voices, calling out to us in the dark. Once, I swore I heard my own voice, laughing maniacally. Then we saw it. A tall, gaunt figure stood at the edge of the firelight, its glowing eyes fixed on us. It moved unnaturally, jerking like a puppet on strings. Tommy grabbed a makeshift weapon, a heavy wrench, and stood by the door. "We're not dying here," he said. But the thing didn't attack. It just watched, its head tilting at odd angles. And then, in a voice that sounded like Daryl's, It said, "Come out and play." Lena screamed, and Tommy slammed the door shut. I knew we couldn't stay. The creature was toying with us, and it was only a matter of time before it grew tired of the game. Lena, trembling, suggested a protective circle. "My grandmother used salt for protection," she said. We poured the salt from our supplies around the RV, praying it would work. The creature paced just beyond the line, its glowing eyes filled with malice. At dawn, we made our move. Grabbing only the essentials, we fled the campsite, running blindly through the woods until we found a ranger station. The rangers didn't believe our story, of course. They said Daryl was likely lost and promised to send a search party, but they never found him. It's been months since that trip, and I still hear the whispers in my dreams. Sometimes, I think I see Daryl's face in the shadows, grinning at me with glowing eyes. Whatever that thing was, it's not done with us, and I don't think it ever will be. My name is Luke Harper. I'm 45 years old, and I've spent most of my life chasing moments through the lens of a camera. I was a wildlife photographer for almost 2 decades, working for big magazines and traveling the globe. But something in me broke a few years ago. Burnout, I guess. I quit the job, sold my apartment in the city, and hit the road in my RV. I thought maybe if I stripped everything back to the basics, I could rediscover my love for the craft. This happened 2 years ago in a place called Ledges State Park in Iowa. At the time, I was traveling through the Midwest, following the fall colors. The park had been recommended to me by another camper, a spot where sandstone cliffs and winding trails cut through the landscape like something out of a painting. It sounded perfect. But no one warned me about the ridge. Locals called it the Devil's Backbone, and from the moment I set foot on it, I knew something was wrong. I pulled into Ledges on a crisp October afternoon. The air smelled like earth and fallen leaves, and the sunlight filtered through the trees in golden streaks. The ranger at the entrance gave me a map and a smile, but warned me to be careful near the backbone after dark. "Why?" I asked, more curious than concerned. "Strange things happen up there," he said. "People get lost, hear things. Some even claim to see things." "Like what?" He shrugged. "Depends on who you ask. Voices, shadows, lights. But it's probably just the wind playing tricks." I laughed it off, but his words stayed with me. The first day was uneventful. I spent the afternoon photographing the sandstone cliffs and the river winding through the park. That evening, I parked my RV at a quiet spot near the edge of the campground, made dinner, and fell asleep early. The next morning, I set out for the Devil's Backbone. The trail leading up to the ridge was steep, cutting through thick woods before opening onto a rocky outcrop. The view was stunning. Trees stretched out in every direction, their leaves a kaleidoscope of orange and red. As I set up my tripod, I heard a voice behind me. "You'll want to be careful up here." I turned to see a young woman standing a few feet away, her curly brown hair pulled back under a knit hat. She had a backpack slung over one shoulder and a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Nina," she said, holding out a hand. "Luke?" I shook it. "Why's everyone so worried about this place?" She shrugged. "Depends on who you ask. My grandfather used to say it was cursed. He disappeared up here when I was a kid. Search parties never found him." I raised an eyebrow. "And you still come up here?" "I like to think he's watching over me," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't fully believe it. We talked for a while. Nina was a local, born and raised in the area, and knew the park like the back of her hand. When I mentioned I was a photographer, she offered to show me some of the best spots on the ridge. As we walked, I noticed something strange. My compass, which I kept clipped to my belt, started spinning erratically. Magnetic interference, I muttered, tapping it. Probably the rocks. Nina didn't look convinced. That happens to people up here, she said. It's part of the legend. What legend? She hesitated. They say the devil's backbone is a gateway. To what, no one knows. But people who linger too long hear voices. Some see shadows. Others disappear. I laughed, but the sound felt hollow in the still air. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, all of it faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. A woman's voice, faint and far away, calling my name. "Luke!" I froze. Nina stopped ahead of me. "What is it?" "Did you hear that?" She shook her head. I scanned the trees, my heart pounding. "I thought I heard someone." Nina's expression darkened. "We should go back." "No," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I want to get some more shots." We reached a spot where the ridge narrowed, flanked by cliffs on either side. A single gnarled tree stood at the center, its bark etched with strange symbols. "This is it," Nina said. "The Devil's Maw." I set up my tripod framing the shot. The whispers had stopped, and for a moment, everything felt normal. Then my camera stopped working. The screen flickered, displaying static before shutting off completely. "What the hell?" I muttered. Checking the battery, it was fully charged. Nina grabbed my arm. "Luke, we need to leave." "Relax," I said, though my own unease was growing. "It's just a technical glitch." But as I looked through the viewfinder, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood behind Nina, tall and shadowy, its eyes glowing red. "Don't move," I whispered. "What?" "There's something behind you." Nina turned, and the figure vanished. The air around us grew heavy, electric. The ground beneath the tree began to crack, splitting open to reveal a dark chasm. From its depths came a sound, low, guttural, like a growl mixed with the creak of ancient wood. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing around us. "Luke!" The voice called again, but this time it wasn't faint. It was clear, deliberate, and coming from the chasm. A massive shadow began to rise, taking the shape of a humanoid figure with clawed hands and glowing eyes. The air vibrated with its presence, and the temperature plummeted. Nina clutched her pack, pulling out a bundle of sage and a lighter. "Don't look at it," she said, her voice trembling. "It feeds on fear." "What is it?" I asked, unable to tear my eyes away. "Something that shouldn't exist." The entity loomed over us, its presence suffocating. Nina lit the sage, the smoke curling upward in pale tendrils. She began muttering something under her breath, a prayer, maybe, or a chant. The creature recoiled, but its glowing eyes remained fixed on me. "You can't fight it," Nina said. "We have to go now." We ran, the ground shifting beneath our feet as the ridge continued to crack and crumble. The whispers grew deafening, the entity's guttural growls reverberating through the trees. When we finally reached the main trail, the noise stopped. The air felt lighter, the whispers gone. Back at the campground, I reviewed the photos I'd taken. Most were normal, but the ones from the ridge were distorted. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and a faint red glow filled the frame. "I told you," Nina said, watching over my shoulder. I nodded, shaken but grateful to be alive. The next morning, I left Ledges State Park, vowing never to return. But as I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it. A pair of glowing red eyes watching me from the trees. The Devil's Maw wasn't done with me. My name is Grace Holloway, and I'm 38 years old. This happened 2 years ago, during a weekend camping trip to Maquoketa Cave State Park in Iowa. Back then, I thought the worst thing I had to deal with was my grief. Losing my sister, Ella, had taken everything out of me. But I was wrong. That trip became something else entirely. Something I still don't understand. I'd been traveling the country in my RV for almost a year, working as a travel nurse and taking time off between assignments. The solitude suited me. After Ella's death, I couldn't stand being around people for too long. She was my only family, and losing her had left a hole I didn't know how to fill. Nature became my escape, my way of feeling something other than loss. When I pulled into Maquoketa Caves State Park, I was struck by its beauty. The wooded trails, the moss-covered rock formations, the caves winding through the earth like veins. It all felt ancient, untouched. The air smelled of damp stone and fresh pine, and for a moment I thought I might find some peace there. That night, I parked my RV in a quiet spot near the edge of the campground. There were a few other campers scattered around, but I chose a site far from everyone else. I liked being alone. After dinner, I sat outside under the stars, journaling about Ella. It was something I did often, trying to keep her memory alive. The first sign that something wasn't right came just after midnight. I was lying in bed, the RV windows cracked to let in the cool night air when I heard it. A faint giggle, high-pitched and distant, like a child playing hide-and-seek. I froze. It was late, and there were no families camping nearby. I sat up, listening. The giggle came again, closer this time, followed by the soft patter of footsteps on the gravel outside. Grabbing my flashlight, I slid out of bed and peeked through the curtains. The light swept over empty picnic tables, a fire pit, and rows of trees beyond. Nothing. I stepped outside, the cold air prickling my skin. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. The footsteps stopped. I stayed up for hours after that, my nerves on edge. But the night passed without further incident, and by morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. A trick of the wind, my mind playing games. The next morning, I met Max, a local historian and part-time park guide. I'd stopped at the visitor center to pick up a trail map, and he struck up a conversation. Max was in his 60s, with a kind face and a voice that carried a slow, deliberate rhythm. He told me about the park's history, its geological formations, and the cave's Native American significance. Then, his tone shifted. "You know about the orphanage, don't you?" he asked. I shook my head. "Back in the 1800s, there was an orphanage just north of here," he explained. "Burned down in a fire. Most of the kids didn't make it out." He hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "Some folks say their spirits are still here, wandering the caves." I laughed nervously. "You don't actually believe that, do you?" Max shrugged. "I've seen things I can't explain. Heard stories from campers like you, footsteps, laughter, little handprints on the walls where no kids have been." He leaned closer. "If you hear them, don't follow. They're not what they seem." The conversation left me unsettled, but I brushed it off. Ghost stories were a staple of any old park, meant to spook tourists and sell postcards. Still, as I hiked the trails that afternoon, Max's words lingered. My hike took me deep into the park, to a cave called Dance Hall. The entrance was wide and inviting, sunlight spilling through the gaps in the limestone ceiling. As I walked deeper, the air grew cooler, the light dimmer. The walls were damp, streaked with moss, and in some places smooth from centuries of water erosion. Then I saw them. Small handprints smeared into the moisture on the walls. They were faint but unmistakable. tiny fingers pressed into the stone. I frowned, touching one. It was cold, wet, fresh. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself it was nothing. Kids explored these caves all the time, right? They probably left the prints earlier that morning. But as I continued through the cave, the handprints didn't stop. They appeared higher up on the walls, in places no child could easily reach. Then I heard it again. The giggle. It echoed through the cavern, bouncing off the walls, making it impossible to tell where it came from. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the darkness, but I was alone. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. Just the steady drip of water from the cave ceiling. I left the cave quickly, my heart pounding. Back at my campsite, I found something strange near the fire pit, a rusted music box, half buried in the dirt. It was old, the kind of thing you'd find at an antique shop, with tarnished brass edges and a faded floral pattern on the lid. Curious, I picked it up and turned the tiny crank. To my surprise, it worked, playing a haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. I didn't want it. I tossed it into the trash bin by my RV and tried to forget about it. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard the melody again. Soft, faint, coming from outside. I sat up, my chest tightening. The trash bin was empty. The music box sat on the table inside the RV, its crank turning on its own. My blood ran cold. The third night, the children came. It started with whispers, faint and unintelligible, just outside the RV. Then came the knocking, a light, rhythmic tap on the door, like tiny fists demanding to be let in. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand trembling. "Who's there?" I shouted. The knocking stopped. When I opened the door, I saw them. A group of children stood in the clearing, their faces pale and translucent, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, tattered dresses, suspenders, and bare feet. "Help us," one of them whispered, her voice soft and pleading. I froze, my instincts warring with my compassion. They looked so real, so vulnerable. But Max's warning echoed in my mind. They're not what they seem. I can't," I stammered. Their expressions twisted, their mouths stretching into unnatural grins. The glow in their eyes brightened, and they stepped closer. "Help us," they repeated, their voices overlapping, growing louder. I slammed the door and locked it, my heart racing. The RV shook violently, as if something massive was pushing against it. The whispers turned to screams, high-pitched and deafening. I grabbed the music box, desperate, and cranked it as hard as I could. The melody filled the RV, drowning out the screams. Outside, the children froze, their faces contorted in anger and fear. One by one, they faded into the darkness. By dawn, the campground was quiet again. The handprints on the RV's windows were the only sign they'd been there. I buried the music box near the ruins of the orphanage, leaving a bouquet of wildflowers in its place. I whispered a prayer for the children, for my sister, for myself. When I drove away, I thought it was over, but as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw them. Small handprints pressed into the condensation on the glass. They haven't followed me since, but I still dream of them sometimes, their pale faces and glowing eyes. And when I hear laughter in the distance, I wonder if they found someone new to call for help. My name is Angela Carter, and I'm 36 years old. This happened just a few months ago in October, during a solo camping trip in Iowa's Chemec State Forest. I've been a wildlife photographer for over a decade, traveling to remote places to capture rare animals in their natural habitats. But this trip was different. It wasn't just about the photos. It was about proving to myself that I could still face the wilderness after the bear attack in Alaska last year. I thought I'd prepared for everything. Isolation, bad weather, even another encounter with a wild animal, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found, or what found me. I pulled into Shimek State Forest late in the afternoon. The campground was nearly empty, just as I'd hoped. The isolation would give me the peace and quiet I needed to focus on photographing the rare barred owl I'd come to find. These birds were notoriously shy, and I knew my best chance of capturing them would be in the deepest parts of the forest. After parking my RV in a secluded spot, I stepped outside to survey the area. The forest was dense, the trees tall and shadowed even in the fading light. The quiet was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As I set up my gear, I thought about Caleb Price, the man I'd met at the gas station on the way here. He'd been scruffy and jittery, the kind of guy you'd cross the street to avoid, but his words stuck with me. Don't stay in that forest too long. The eyes in the dark, they don't like visitors. I shook off the memory. Superstition. Every remote place had its ghost stories, and I wasn't here for that. I was here for the owls. The first night passed uneventfully, though I didn't sleep well. The woods felt too quiet, like they were holding their breath. I chalked it up to nerves and exhaustion. The next day, I set out early, following a trail that led deeper into the forest. About 2 miles in, I noticed something odd. A set of tracks crossing the path. They were large, larger than any human or animal I'd ever seen. The shape was vaguely humanoid, with long, clawed toes that sank deep into the mud. My pulse quickened as I crouched to examine them, but I reminded myself to stay calm. Strange tracks didn't necessarily mean danger. Later, while setting up a motion-activated camera, I heard a faint rustling behind me. Turning quickly, I scanned the trees, but there was nothing there. Just shadows and swaying branches. Still, the feeling of being watched stayed with me for the rest of the hike. That night, things escalated. I was sitting by the RV's small table, reviewing the day's photos, when the power flickered. My laptop screen went black, followed by the lights overhead. The RV's battery was fully charged. I'd checked before leaving, but now it was completely dead. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside to check the generator. The forest was pitch dark, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. As I rounded the corner of the RV, my beam caught something. 2 glowing eyes, reflecting back at me from the trees. I froze. The eyes were too high to belong to any animal I knew, and they didn't blink. They just stared, unblinking and eerily still. My breath caught as I raised the flashlight, trying to see more, but the eyes vanished before the light could reach them. I backed into the RV, locking the door behind me. The power hadn't returned, and the silence felt suffocating. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or an owl, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I discovered strange claw marks on the trees surrounding my campsite. They spiraled upward in intricate patterns, unlike anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't just scratches, it was deliberate, as though someone or something had carved them with purpose. I thought about leaving right then, but I couldn't bring myself to pack up. This project wasn't just work. It was my way of proving to myself that I wasn't broken, that I could still do this. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest didn't want me there. That evening, as I reviewed the footage from my motion cameras, I noticed something disturbing. One of the cameras had captured a faint, blurry outline of a figure. It was tall, with unnaturally long limbs and a gaunt frame. It stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the range of the lens, watching. I felt a chill run through me. Could it have been another camper? A hunter? The tracks I'd seen earlier came back to me, along with Caleb's words. the eyes in the dark. That night, the footsteps returned. They circled the RV, slow and deliberate. At one point, I heard breathing, low, guttural, and close. I stayed inside, clutching my camera like a talisman, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. By the fourth night, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I decided to set up one last camera in a clearing near the trail, hoping to capture something, anything, that could explain what was happening. As I waited in the darkness, flashlight in hand, the forest grew eerily still. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of wildlife. Just silence. Then I saw it. The creature stepped into the clearing, its gaunt frame illuminated by the faint moonlight. It was taller than any human, with elongated limbs that moved unnaturally, almost insect-like. Its face was pale and featureless, save for the glowing eyes that burned into mine. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The silent watcher, as I would later come to think of it, stood there for what felt like an eternity, tilting its head as though studying me. My hands trembled as I raised my camera, the flash exploding in the dark. The creature recoiled, vanishing into the trees with unnatural speed. I sat there, frozen, until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Back at the RV, I reviewed the photos. Most were blurry, but one was clear enough to show the creature's gaunt form and glowing eyes. I stared at it for hours, torn between relief and terror. I packed up and left Shimek that morning, swearing never to return. The photo remains locked away on my hard drive, a haunting reminder of what I saw. I've never shown it to anyone. Some things are better left in the dark. I don't know what the silent watcher was or why it let me go, but I do know this. The forest belongs to it, and I was trespassing. If you ever find yourself in Shimek State Forest, remember this. Sometimes, the eyes in the dark aren't just your imagination. My name is Michael Reed, and I'm 41 years old. This happened in late October last year, not long after I lost my wife, Dana. I'd taken to the road in our RV, looking for solitude and a way to process the gaping hole her death had left in my life. Dolliver Memorial State Park in Iowa seemed like the perfect place. Remote, historical, and steeped in legend. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found there. I pulled into the nearly empty campground in the late afternoon. The air was crisp, the leaves a riot of reds and yellows. Dolliver's deep ravines and ancient cliffs made it feel like a world untouched by time. It was beautiful, yes, but there was something heavy about the place, like the forest was holding its breath. The ranger on duty, Maggie Harper, gave me a map and a strained smile when I asked about the old burial grounds I'd read about online. "Stick to the marked trails," she said, her voice low. "And don't wander too far after dark. People get turned around out here." I nodded, not thinking much of it. Park rangers love to dramatize things to keep tourists in line, right? I parked the RV at a secluded spot near the edge of the forest and settled in. The first night passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were watching me. The next morning, I set out on a hike. The trail wound through towering cliffs and dense woods, the only sounds my boots crunching on fallen leaves and the occasional caw of a crow. About an hour in, I spotted it, a narrow, overgrown path branching off from the main trail. It wasn't on the map Maggie had given me. Curiosity got the better of me. Pushing through the underbrush, I found myself in a small clearing. Weathered gravestones jutted from the ground, their inscriptions too faded to read. But one grave stood out, its soil freshly disturbed, as if it had been dug up recently. The air around it was icy, far colder than the crisp autumn morning. As I stood there, a rustling noise came from the woods behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, but saw nothing, just trees and shadows. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. On my way back to the RV, I met him. A stooped old man with a scraggly beard and a crooked walking stick. He appeared so suddenly it was as if he'd stepped out of the trees themselves. "Graveyard's no place for the living," he said, his voice raspy and thin. "Best leave it alone." "Who are you?" I asked, startled. "Just a wanderer," he said with a shrug. "Looking for something I lost a long time ago." Before I could press him further, he turned and shuffled off into the woods. I called after him, but he didn't respond. When I got back to camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that his warning was more than just a bit of local color. That night, things started happening. I was lying in bed reading when I heard it. Soft footsteps outside the RV. I froze, listening as the steps circled the vehicle. Grabbing my flashlight, I peered out the window, but there was nothing there. Just darkness and the faint rustle of leaves. Then I noticed something else. Carved into the trees around my campsite were strange symbols, circles, lines, and shapes that looked almost like eyes. They hadn't been there when I arrived. The footsteps continued sporadically throughout the night. Each time I got up to check, there was no one there. The next day, I returned to the graveyard, drawn back by a mix of curiosity and dread. As I stood by the disturbed grave, the air seemed to ripple around me. My vision blurred, and suddenly, I was no longer in the clearing. I saw a crowd of people, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, gathered around the very spot where I stood. They were shouting, their faces twisted with anger. At the center of the mob was a young woman, her hands bound and her face streaked with tears. "She's a witch!" someone cried. "No!" the woman screamed. "Please, you've got it wrong." They didn't listen. I watched, horrified, as they buried her alive. Her muffled screams echoed in my ears long after the vision faded. I stumbled back to the RV, my mind racing. Was it a hallucination? A memory of the land itself? Whatever it was, it felt real. Too real. That night, the activity in the RV intensified. The air grew icy, my breath fogging in front of me despite the heater running at full blast. Objects started moving on their own. My notebook slid off the table, the cupboards creaked open and shut. Then, the whispers began. "Help me!" The voice was faint, feminine, and filled with pain. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down I knew better. The symbols outside the RV seemed to glow faintly, as if holding something at bay. I woke in the middle of the night to find the RV shaking violently. Outside, the shadow of a woman stood just beyond the tree line, her face pale and hollow, her eyes black pits. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and turning into anguished screams. "You disturbed her rest," came a voice from nowhere. "You must make it right." I knew what I had to do. Grabbing a flashlight and a pocket knife, I raced back to the graveyard. The symbols on the trees had faded, and the temperature dropped with every step I took. By the time I reached the clearing, she was there, standing over the disturbed grave, her form flickering like a dying flame. "I'm sorry," I whispered, carving the protective symbols into the surrounding trees. My hands shook as the spirit's screams filled the air. The ground beneath me trembled, and the forest seemed to close in, the shadows growing deeper and darker. With the final symbol carved, the spirit let out a deafening wail and vanished in a burst of cold wind. The grave sealed itself, the soil smoothing over as if it had never been disturbed. When dawn broke, the graveyard looked different. The headstones were no longer crumbling but stood upright and pristine. A plaque near the largest grave read, "Here lies Eleanor Price, falsely accused and executed." May her spirit find peace. I left Dolliver Memorial State Park that morning, shaken but alive. The RV felt warmer, lighter, as if the oppressive weight had lifted. I don't know if Eleanor found peace, but I like to think she did. Now, as I write this, I'm still haunted by what I saw and heard. I've dedicated my project to telling stories like hers, voices lost to time, waiting for someone to listen. Some things should never be forgotten, and some places should never be disturbed. If you ever find yourself at Dolliver Memorial, heed the warnings. The past isn't always at rest. My name is Sarah Cooper, and I'm 29 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened in October, just a few months ago, at Effigy Mounds National Monument in Iowa. It started as a simple camping trip with my brother Eli, his best friend Mia, and her boyfriend Derek, but it became something none of us could have ever imagined. I thought a weekend out in nature would help us all reconnect. My brother and I hadn't been close for years. College, work, and life had gotten in the way. Mia suggested making it a group thing, hoping it would take the pressure off. Derek brought the gear, and I brought the food. We thought we were prepared. We weren't. We reached the park on a chilly Friday afternoon. The trees, still heavy with autumn leaves, glowed red and gold in the late-day sun. Effigy Mounds is known for its eerie beauty, ancient burial mounds shaped like animals dotting the forest. Local legends talk about spirits protecting the land, but we brushed those stories off as just that, stories. The ranger who checked us in, a wiry man with weathered skin, gave us a look when I mentioned our campsite deep in the forest. "Respect the land," he said, "and it might respect you back." I laughed nervously, thinking he was just playing up the mystique of the place. Eli rolled his eyes, muttering something about tourist traps. I shot him a look but let it go. He never took anything seriously. By sunset, we'd set up camp near the river. Derek, ever the Boy Scout, had gotten a fire going, and Mia had convinced us to toast marshmallows even before dinner. It was peaceful. I should have enjoyed it more, but something about the forest felt off. Too quiet. Too still. The first strange thing happened after we'd gone to bed. We were crammed into 2 tents because Eli's was torn, a fact he conveniently neglected to mention until we got there. I shared one with Mia, while Derek and Eli took the other. The ground was hard, and the air was freezing, but I must have drifted off because I woke to a sound outside. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but then I heard it clearly, a low, mournful cry that carried through the night. It wasn't an animal. I've been camping enough to know the difference between a coyote's howl and whatever this was. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Mia. She was already awake, her eyes wide. "Probably a deer," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. In the other tent, Derek stirred. "What is that?" he called out. "Go back to sleep." Eli groaned, always the skeptic. None of us got much rest after that. The next morning, I found my jacket shredded and hanging from a low branch about 20 feet from camp. It looked like something had clawed it to pieces, though Derek insisted it must have gotten caught on the brambles when I wasn't looking. "I didn't take it off," I said, holding up the ruined fabric. "It was inside the tent." Eli shrugged. "A raccoon, maybe?" "A raccoon didn't do this," I snapped, but I dropped it. I didn't want to ruin the trip over something I couldn't explain. We spent the day hiking the trails, passing by several of the burial mounds. They were unsettling, even in broad daylight. The largest, shaped like a bear, loomed over us, its contours stark against the blue sky. Mia lingered, snapping photos, while Derek muttered about staying on schedule. "Come on," he said. "We've got to get back before dark." He was right. By the time we returned to camp, the shadows were long, and the air had turned icy. The fire felt like our only protection against the creeping dark. That night, things escalated. Around midnight, Eli woke me up, shaking my arm. "Sarah," he hissed, "I heard you calling me." I was asleep, I said groggily, but his face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "It was your voice," he insisted. "Out in the woods." My stomach turned. I wanted to tell him he was imagining things, but I'd heard something too, a faint whispering just outside the tent, so quiet I couldn't make out the words. We huddled by the fire, all four of us. Mia was trying to stay calm, but her hands trembled as she held her mug of coffee. Derek kept scanning the trees, his flashlight beam bouncing off the trunks. Then Mia froze. "Did you see that?" she whispered, pointing into the darkness. We all turned. At first, I thought she was imagining things, but then I saw it too, a pale figure standing just beyond the firelight. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. And then it was gone, slipping into the shadows like smoke. "What the hell was that?" Derek whispered. No one had an answer. We should have left then, but Derek convinced us to stay. "It's just some weird local wildlife," he said. "We'll leave tomorrow." That morning, Mia grew distant. Her usual bubbly energy replaced with something cold and sharp. She stared off into the woods as if listening to something none of us could hear. "I think we should go," I said. But Eli scoffed. "You're overreacting." "Am I?" I wanted to scream, but I bit my tongue. I didn't want to give him another reason to think I was being dramatic. That evening, Derek wandered off to relieve himself and came back different. He was quieter, his movements slower, as if something was weighing him down. When I asked if he was okay, he just nodded, avoiding eye contact. By the time the sun set, the forest felt alive, pressing in on us from all sides. The whispers were louder now, no longer confined to the edge of hearing. They were all around us. "Marcus!" The voice was mine this time, calling out from somewhere deep in the trees. "Help me!" Eli stood, his face pale. "Sarah, stop it." "It's not me," I said, my voice trembling. The night was chaos. Derek attacked first, lunging at Eli with a strength that didn't seem human. His eyes were wild, his mouth twisting into an unnatural snarl. It took all three of us to restrain him, tying him to a tree with the last of our rope. "We need to leave," Mia said, her voice shaking. "We can't just leave him like this," I protested. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure he was still Derek. His head lolled forward, and when he looked up at me, his eyes were black as pitch. The whispers grew louder, joined by rustling all around us. The pale figures emerged from the trees, more of them this time. Their forms were wrong, too tall, their limbs too long, their faces blank and hollow. "They're skinwalkers," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Offerings," she said. "We have to appease them." We piled everything we had by the fire, food, clothes, anything of value, but it wasn't enough. The figures kept advancing, their hollow eyes fixed on us. Finally, I made a decision. "Run," I told Eli and Mia. "I'll hold them off." "Sarah, no!" Eli shouted, but I shoved him toward the trees. "Go!" I screamed. I turned to face the creatures, clutching a burning branch from the fire. "You want me?" I shouted. "Come and get me." I don't remember much after that. The last thing I saw was Eli and Mia disappearing into the trees as the creatures closed in. Then everything went dark. They told me weeks later that Eli returned with the search party, but they found no trace of me. Just my shredded jacket hanging from a tree near the burial mounds. Now I'm here, writing this down, trying to make sense of it all. Maybe someone will read this and think twice before venturing too deep into effigy mounds. Respect the land, and pray it respects you back. My name is Luke Mathers. I'm 36 years old, and a part of me thought this trip to Hanging Rock Bluff would be a way to find some peace. I was wrong. What happened over the course of 3 days on that cliff will haunt me for the rest of my life. I wasn't looking for adventure, I just wanted some quiet. A break from the guilt I've been carrying since my younger brother Eric died in a hiking accident 6 months ago. He had been following my lead when he slipped, and no amount of "it wasn't your fault" from well-meaning friends has made me believe it. So I packed up my RV and drove to Hanging Rock Bluff, a remote, jagged cliff overlooking the Des Moines River. I'd guided groups through places like this for years. Nature was my comfort zone. But what I encountered at the bluff was anything but natural. The drive to the bluff was uneventful, a mix of winding roads and fall colors fading into the chill of late October. I arrived mid-afternoon, parked the RV at a primitive campsite near the cliff's edge, and began setting up. The place was serene, with a spectacular view of the river below. I even caught myself thinking this might actually be what I needed. As I unloaded my gear, a park ranger pulled up in her dusty Jeep. Her name tag read Patty Glenn, and she had the kind of no-nonsense demeanor you'd expect from someone who spent decades dealing with reckless campers. "You camping here alone?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Needed to get away for a bit." She nodded, but her eyes lingered on me. "Stay on the marked trails and keep your fire contained. And, watch yourself after dark. There've been strange reports from this area." "Strange how?" Patty hesitated, then shrugged. "Mostly hikers seeing things. Shadowy figures, weird chanting. You know how people get with stories. Anyway, just stick to the basics and you'll be fine." I thanked her, but as she drove off, I couldn't shake the feeling that her warning wasn't just about safety. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the wind picked up, carrying a bone-deep chill. I built a fire and settled in with a thermos of soup, letting the warmth push away the memories that had been gnawing at me all day. Around 10 p.m., the wind began to howl, and I heard something else, faint and rhythmic, almost like chanting. I stood up, straining to hear over the crackling fire. The sound was coming from somewhere down the bluff. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the edge, but all I saw was darkness. The chanting stopped, replaced by the sound of rocks clattering down the cliff. My first thought was wildlife, maybe a deer or raccoon, but when I looked again, I swore I saw movement in the shadows below. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be. The morning was cold and gray, with a mist hanging over the river. I decided to hike a nearby trail, hoping the physical activity would clear my head. But the further I went, the more uneasy I felt. About a mile in, I noticed something carved into the bark of a tree, a strange symbol, like a spiral surrounded by jagged lines. It looked deliberate, too precise to be random scratches. I took a photo, intending to look it up later. As I continued, I found more symbols etched into trees and rocks, all leading back toward the bluff. They felt wrong, like they didn't belong there. When I returned to my campsite, the firewood I'd left stacked by the RV was scattered. The forest around me was eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own breathing. That night, the chanting returned, louder this time. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, circling my campsite. I stayed inside the RV, clutching a mug of coffee and trying to convince myself it was just the wind. Then I saw the footprints, barefoot, human-sized prints, leading from the edge of the bluff to the door of my RV. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard someone or something outside. Around 3 a.m., I made the mistake of looking out the window. A figure stood at the edge of the bluff, silhouetted against the moonlight. It was tall and cloaked in shadow, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. I don't know how long I stared before I finally turned away, heart pounding. When I looked back, it was gone. By the time dawn broke, I was on edge, my nerves frayed. I told myself I'd pack up and leave, but part of me wanted to know what was happening. Around midday, I met Andy Bellamy, a young camper at a nearby site. He was wiry and jittery, with the kind of manic energy that made you question whether he was trustworthy. "You seen them yet?" he asked, his voice low. "Seen who?" "The shadow people," he said, glancing around nervously. "They're always watching. Heard 'em chanting last night, didn't you?" I didn't answer, but my silence must have given me away. Andy grinned, a wild, unsettling grin. "They want something from you, same thing they want from all of us." I walked away, but his words stuck with me. That evening, the fog rolled in thick, cloaking the bluff in a damp, suffocating haze. I stayed close to the RV, reluctant to wander too far. As the fire flickered and dimmed, I heard a voice. Soft. Familiar. "Luke." It was Eric. My chest tightened as I turned toward the sound. There, just beyond the firelight, was my brother. His face was pale, his clothes soaked as if he'd been caught in a storm. "Eric?" I whispered. He smiled, beckoning me closer. "Come on, Luke. I've been waiting for you." Tears blurred my vision as I took a step forward, but something in the back of my mind screamed at me to stop. This wasn't right. Eric was gone. The figure's smile twisted into something cruel. Its eyes began to glow, and its form shifted, elongating into a dark, shadowy mass. The chanting grew deafening, and shadowy figures emerged from the fog, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They were the coven, and they wanted me. I grabbed a branch from the fire, holding it like a torch as the shadows closed in. The flames seemed to repel them, but not for long. I remembered the symbols I'd seen on the trees and began carving one into the dirt with my multi-tool, using salt for my provisions to trace a protective circle. The figures hissed and writhed, unable to cross the barrier. Their whispers grew desperate, clawing at the edges of the circle. Finally, as dawn broke, the coven dissolved into the fog, leaving behind nothing but silence. I didn't wait to see if they'd return. I packed up and left the bluff as fast as I could. Weeks later, I found one of their symbols etched into the side of my RV. And every so often, when I'm alone at night, I hear Eric's voice calling my name. My name is Ellie Grayson. I'm 27 years old, a freelance travel writer, and this happened in the summer of 2022. My husband, Jake, and I were on a cross-country RV trip when we decided to camp at Preparation Canyon State Park in Iowa's Loess Hills. I had read about its remote trails and beautiful overlooks, but what caught my eye was a vague mention of Native American legends tied to the area. It seemed perfect for my blog, a mix of breathtaking scenery and a hint of mystery. Jake, being the practical one, wasn't as thrilled. "You sure this is a good idea?" he asked as we drove into the park. The gravel road was narrow and lined with the dense woods that seemed to close in around us. "It's beautiful," I said, trying to sound confident. "And remote. No noisy campers or crowded trails." Jake grunted, focusing on the road. He'd been irritable since the RV's generator started acting up the day before. "Just don't get us stuck out here," he muttered. We set up camp near the edge of the forest, a spot that felt secluded and peaceful. The air was warm, the sunlight filtered through the leaves, and the hills rolled into the distance like something out of a painting. I snapped photos while Jake tinkered with the generator. "You're wasting your time," I called over to him. "Come hike with me." He looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Someone has to make sure this thing works, or we'll be eating cold beans in the dark." Typical Jake, logical, grounded, and completely unwilling to let loose. I grabbed my camera and decided to explore on my own. The trail started out easy, winding gently uphill, but the farther I went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of the forest, birdsong, rustling leaves, distant chirping, seemed to fade. Soon, there was only the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and my own breathing. That's when I felt it. A presence. It's hard to describe, but it was as if the forest itself was watching me. I stopped and turned, half expecting to see someone behind me, but there was no one. Just the trees, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. I shook it off and kept walking, though my pace quickened. About half an hour in, I spotted movement up ahead. A figure, tall and thin, walking away from me down the trail. "Hello?" I called out. The figure didn't respond. They didn't even look back. I jogged a little to catch up, but when I rounded the bend, they were gone. The trail was empty. Back at the RV, Jake was scowling at a bundle of wires. "This thing's toast," he said as I approached. "We're running on fumes." "Well, the forest is creepy as hell, so maybe it's a sign we should leave," I joked, but my voice lacked conviction. Jake glanced at me. "You okay?" "Yeah, just weird vibes out there." He rolled his eyes. "You and your vibes." We argued briefly about whether to stay another night, but I won out. I wasn't ready to give up on the photos and blog content I'd hoped to capture. That night, I woke to the sound of Jake's voice. "Ellie," he said softly, "come here." I blinked, groggy, and realized the voice was coming from outside the RV. I sat up, heart pounding. Jake was next to me, asleep. "Ellie," the voice called again, closer this time. My stomach twisted into a knot. I peered out the window and saw him, Jake, standing at the edge of the forest, his back to me. "Jake?" I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He stirred and opened his eyes. "What?" I pointed to the window. "You're outside." Jake frowned, sitting up. He looked out, then back at me. "Stay here." He grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. I watched from the window as he scanned the area, the beam of light sweeping through the trees. "There's no one here," he said when he came back. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to laugh it off. "Maybe I dreamed it," I said over breakfast. Jake didn't respond. He was examining deep scratches on the RV's door, 3 parallel gouges that hadn't been there the day before. "Raccoons," he muttered, but he didn't sound convinced. We decided to hike together that day, sticking to the main trails. Still, the eerie silence persisted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We found tracks, large, clawed, and too deep to belong to a deer. They led into the woods but disappeared abruptly, as if whatever made them had simply vanished. Jake tried to stay logical, but I could see the tension in his jaw. "Let's head back," he said finally. That night, things escalated. We were sitting by the fire trying to relax when we heard it. My voice, calling Jake's name. We froze. "Ellie," it said again, but it was wrong, off somehow, like a recording played on an old, warped cassette. Jake grabbed my hand. "Get in the RV," he whispered. We locked the doors and shut the windows, but the voice continued, circling the RV. Then it changed. "Jake!" it called, now mimicking me perfectly. I could feel the blood drain from my face. Jake grabbed a knife from the kitchenette and stood by the door, his knuckles white. The voice became more frantic, louder, screaming his name. It slammed against the RV, rocking it slightly. "What is it?" I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know," Jake said, his voice shaking. The banging stopped around dawn. When we stepped outside, the campsite was empty, but the ground was littered with claw marks and tufts of fur. The RV's windows were scratched, and the fire pit had been scattered. "We're leaving," Jake said. But the RV wouldn't start. The generator was dead, and the backup batteries were drained. Jake worked frantically while I kept watch, clutching a flashlight and trying not to panic. When I saw him, Jake, standing in the trees again, I nearly screamed. This time the figure turned to look at me. Its face was almost Jake's, but stretched, twisted wrong. "Ellie," it said, grinning too wide. We managed to start the RV just as the creature emerged from the woods, running toward us on all fours. Its mimicry was distorted now, guttural and alien. Jake floored the gas, and we sped down the gravel road, the creature chasing us for what felt like miles. It stopped abruptly at the park's boundary, watching as we drove away. We didn't talk about it for days. Even now, I don't know what we saw, but I've read enough since to believe it was something ancient, tied to the land and its legends. I've never returned to Loess Hills, and I never will. Some places are meant to be left alone. My name is Claire Foster. I'm 29 years old, and this story happened last summer. After a devastating accident on a school field trip where one of my students drowned, I've carried a crushing weight of guilt. The world called it an accident, but in my heart I couldn't let it go. I needed space, time to think and heal, or so I thought. That's why I took my RV to Yellow Smoke Park in Denison, Iowa. I told myself the trip was about peace and closure. I'd hike, write in my journal, and maybe find some kind of forgiveness. But Yellow Smoke had other plans for me. I arrived on a warm June morning. The lake sparkled under the sun, and the woods around the campground buzzed with life. It looked idyllic, exactly the kind of place I'd imagined. I parked my RV near the edge of the lake, close enough to hear the water lapping against the shore, but far enough from the main camping area to feel the solitude I craved. The first day was uneventful. I walked the trails, snapping photos of birds and wildflowers, and returned to my RV just as the sun began to set. That's when I heard it for the first time. Faint laughter, high-pitched and joyful, coming from the direction of the lake. I smiled, despite myself. It was nice to hear kids playing, a reminder of the good moments I'd had with my students before the accident. But as I peered out the window, something felt off. The campground was quiet, and I hadn't seen any families nearby. Yet, near the water's edge, I saw a little girl. She was playing alone, her pale dress swaying in the breeze. "Hey, sweetie," I called, stepping out of the RV. "Where are your parents?" The girl froze. Slowly, she turned to look at me. Her face was blank, expressionless. My stomach twisted. She pointed toward the lake, then turned and ran toward the water, disappearing into the mist. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe her parents were just out of sight, or maybe I was tired from the long drive. That night, I wrote about her in my journal, describing her pale dress and the odd, hollow look in her eyes. But sleep didn't come easily. I woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of faint knocking. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I heard it again. Deliberate, rhythmic, and coming from the door of my RV. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window. The knocking stopped. But as I shone the beam of light across the foggy campground, I saw them. Small, muddy handprints streaked across the side of my RV. I slammed the curtain shut and spent the rest of the night clutching my flashlight, listening to the whispers that seemed to float on the breeze. The next day, I tried to distract myself with another hike. The woods were dense and lush, the air cool beneath the canopy of leaves. I told myself that what had happened the night before was just my imagination. That's when I saw her again, the little girl. She was standing at the edge of the trail, watching me. "Hi," I said cautiously, stepping closer. She tilted her head. "Do you want to play?" The question sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced a smile. "Where are your parents?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and started walking deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed her. We emerged into a clearing where an old, rusted playground stood. Swings creaked in the breeze, and a decayed slide leaned precariously to one side. Carved into the wood of a splintered seesaw were names, dozens of them, some faded, some fresh. "What is this place?" I asked, but the girl was gone. I returned to my RV shaken. That evening, I drove into town to pick up some supplies and couldn't resist asking the cashier about the playground. "You found that old thing?" she said, her face pale. "No one's used it in years." "Why not?" She hesitated, then leaned in. "Because it's cursed. Everyone knows that. Kids drown in that lake and their spirits linger. They say they're looking for playmates." I forced a laugh, but it came out hollow. "Ghost stories?" "You believe what you want," she said, her tone serious. I drove back to the campground with a heavy heart, the weight of the stories pressing against my chest. That night, the little girl came to my RV door. I heard her faint voice calling, "Claire, come outside, we can play now." My blood ran cold. I hadn't told her my name. I stayed frozen in my seat, clutching my flashlight as the knocking began again, this time more insistent. When I finally worked up the courage to look out the window, I saw not just her, but a group of children, their faces pale and their eyes dark. They surrounded the RV, their small hands leaving streaks of mud across the windows. "Come play with us," they chanted, their voices overlapping in an eerie melody. I screamed, grabbing my journal and clutching it to my chest. The next morning, I resolved to end it. I hiked back to the playground, determined to face whatever was haunting me. The air was thick with tension, the woods unnervingly silent. When I reached the clearing, the children were waiting. Maggie, as I'd come to call the little girl, stood at the center, her expression calm, but her eyes filled with sadness. "You let us down," she said, her voice soft. "I didn't mean to," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "It was an accident." The other children began to move closer, their pale forms flickering like static. "You let her drown," Maggie said, her tone turning accusing. "I know," I sobbed. "I know I failed. I'm sorry." The children paused, their movements stilling as my words echoed in the clearing. "I'm sorry," I said again, louder this time. "I'm sorry I couldn't save her. I'm sorry I wasn't enough." The children stared at me for a long moment, then began to fade, one by one, until only Maggie remained. "Thank you for playing with us," she said, her voice almost kind. Then she, too, disappeared. The park was quiet when I returned to my RV. The handprints were gone, and the air felt lighter, less oppressive. I left a bouquet of wildflowers by the lake before I drove away, a small token of my regret and hope for forgiveness. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw Maggie standing by the water, her pale dress swaying in the breeze. She raised a hand in farewell, and for the first time I felt a sliver of peace. That night, when I opened my journal, I found a new entry written in a child's handwriting. "Thank you for playing with us. We forgive you." My name is Jack Whitman. I'm 45 years old, and last spring I set out on an RV road trip across the Midwest. After my divorce and losing my job, I felt like I needed to get away from the noise of the city and, frankly, from myself. I wanted solitude, time to think, and maybe a little peace. What I found at Pikes Peak State Park in Iowa was something else entirely, something I can't explain even now. It started like any other stop on my trip. I pulled my beat-up RV into the small campground on a misty April morning. The park was quiet, with only a few other campers scattered around, their tents barely visible through the fog rolling off the Mississippi River. It was perfect, isolated, but not desolate. After parking near a trail that led to the bluff, I stepped out to take in the view. The cliffs loomed high above the water, the kind of place that felt timeless, ancient. The fog clung to the edges, blurring the line between land and sky. It was beautiful, sure, but there was something else about it. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The first day was uneventful. I hiked a few trails, snapped some photos of the river, and scribbled a few half-hearted journal entries in the evening. Writing had always been my outlet, even back when I was a journalist. Now, it was more of a lifeline, something to keep me grounded when the weight of my regrets threatened to crush me. That night, I cooked dinner over a camp stove and settled in to read. The fog was thicker than before, swirling outside the RV windows like smoke. The quiet was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Around midnight, I heard something. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It was a voice, faint and indistinct, carried on the breeze. I froze, straining to listen. "Jack," it whispered. I bolted upright. It was distant, almost too faint to hear, but it was unmistakable. My name. Jack. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the darkness. The fog swallowed the beam of light almost immediately, reducing visibility to a few feet. My pulse thundered in my ears. "Hello," I called, my voice shaky. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Jack." I backed toward the RV, my heart pounding. The voice didn't sound threatening, but it didn't sound right either. It had a hollow, echoing quality, like it was coming from a broken radio. I shut the door and locked it, refusing to go back outside. The next morning, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd been dreaming, or maybe the stress of the last few months was finally catching up with me. I forced myself to focus on the day's plans. More hiking, more writing, anything to distract me. As I walked along one of the trails near the bluff, I came across another camper. She was sitting on a fallen log, staring out at the river. "Morning," I said, giving her a nod. She turned to look at me, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't go near the bluff after dark," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was a strange intensity in her eyes. I frowned. "Why's that?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "People say it's haunted." "Haunted?" I couldn't help but chuckle. She didn't smile. "There's something out there. Something old. It doesn't like to be disturbed." I thought about the voice I'd heard the night before, but I didn't say anything. Instead, I just nodded and kept walking, brushing her off as a superstitious local. That night, the voice returned. I was sitting at the small table in the RV, writing in my journal, when I heard it again. "Jack!" It was louder this time, clearer. My pen slipped from my hand, leaving a jagged line across the page. "Jack, Come outside." My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't just calling my name, it was inviting me. Against my better judgment, I stepped to the window and peered out. The fog was even thicker than the night before, and I could barely make out the shapes of the trees. But then, in the distance, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the bluff. It was tall and shadowy, its outline blurry in the mist. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Come outside," the voice repeated, louder now. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping onto the damp ground. My hands trembled as I pointed the beam of light toward the bluff, but the figure was gone. The whispers continued, growing fainter as if retreating into the woods. The next morning, I found my journal pages filled with words I didn't remember writing. "This is your fault. You can't run. He's waiting." The words were scrawled in my handwriting, but I had no memory of writing them. My stomach churned as I flipped through the pages, each one more disturbing than the last. That afternoon, I ran into the camper again, the woman who had warned me about the bluff. "Something's out there," I said, my voice low. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "It always finds the broken ones," she said. I wanted to ask what she meant, but she turned and walked away before I could. That night, I couldn't stay in the RV. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the bluff, determined to prove to myself that there was nothing out there. The fog wrapped around me as I approached the edge, the sound of the river below muffled and distant. I stopped when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the bluff, his back to me. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. "Jack," he said, his voice smooth and deep. I froze. The figure turned, and I saw his face, or rather the lack of it. His features were indistinct, like a smear on a canvas, but his eyes glowed faintly red. "I know what you want," he said. "I can give it to you." I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "All your pain, all your guilt, it can be gone. You just have to say yes." He extended a hand, long and pale, his fingers unnaturally thin. I took a step back, shaking my head. The devil smiled. "Think about it, Jack. No more regret, no more loneliness, no more failure." Images flashed through my mind. My ex-wife's angry face, the newsroom where I'd been fired, the empty apartment I'd left behind. "No," I whispered. His smile faded. "Are you sure?" I turned and ran. I don't know how I made it back to the RV. The whispers followed me the whole way, louder and more insistent, but I didn't look back. By the time I reached the RV, the fog had begun to lift, and the forest was eerily quiet. I left the park at dawn, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing at the edge of the bluff, watching me go. And I swear he was smiling. My name is Emma Holt, and I'm 32 years old. This happened in October of last year, deep in the forests of Backbone State Park in Iowa. I'm a wildlife photographer by trade, and I've spent countless nights alone in remote locations capturing the raw beauty of nature. But nothing I've ever experienced compares to what happened over those 3 nights. I had come to Backbone State Park because it was said to be one of the most pristine places to photograph autumn wildlife. The rust-colored leaves, the misty mornings, and the promise of solitude were exactly what I needed. I parked my RV at a secluded site, tucked away on an old trail where few campers ventured. It was perfect, quiet, undisturbed, and far enough from the main campground that I could feel entirely alone. Or so I thought. The first night started uneventfully. I set up my equipment. a trail camera positioned to catch nocturnal wildlife, a lantern at the center of my camp, and my tripod with my best camera near the edge of the woods. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest was eerily quiet. I chalked it up to the time of year, animals preparing for winter, their routines changing. The quiet didn't bother me. In fact, I enjoyed it. Around midnight, as I reviewed some test shots inside the RV, I heard it. A faint whispering sound outside. At first, I thought it was the wind. It had to be. But as I turned off the lights and strained to listen, I realized it wasn't random. The whispers were rhythmic, almost conversational, though I couldn't make out any words. I opened the RV door just a crack and peered out, shining my flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. The forest looked the same as always, save for the unnatural stillness. Shaking my head, I blamed my exhaustion and locked the door. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed me to sleep, faint and persistent, like a voice just out of reach. The next morning, I met Mike, the park ranger. I had driven into the ranger station to report a minor issue with one of the trails, fallen branches blocking a path, and decided to ask about the sounds I'd heard. Mike was in his 50s, gruff and weathered, with the kind of demeanor that suggested he'd seen a thing or two in his years working in the woods. "Whispers, huh?" he said, scratching his beard. Not the first time someone's mentioned that. I raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" He leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "There's an old legend around these parts. They call it the Whisperer. Some kind of spirit or skinwalker, depending on who you ask. They say it mimics voices, lures people off the trails. Just stories, of course." He gave me a wink, but the edge in his voice told me he wasn't entirely joking. I laughed it off and thanked him for his help, though his words stuck with me. Skinwalkers. I'd heard of them before, shape-shifting creatures from Native American folklore, said to mimic human voices to lure their victims. But I wasn't about to let campfire stories scare me off. That second night, things escalated. I had just finished setting up my trail camera when I noticed something strange. The batteries in my equipment, which I'd charged earlier that day, were almost completely drained. My lantern flickered and dimmed, and my night vision camera refused to turn on. I swore under my breath. I'd brought extras, of course, but the inconvenience was irritating. I replaced the batteries and moved on. Around 10 p.m., as I reviewed my first few shots, I saw it. A figure in the corner of one frame. It was distant, near the tree line, tall and spindly with elongated limbs. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a deer distorted by the shadows. But the longer I stared, the less it looked like anything natural. My stomach churned, but I shook it off. I had seen shadows play tricks on me before. This was no different. I went to bed uneasy, but sleep didn't come easily. The whispers returned around midnight. This time, they were louder, closer. They came from all around the RV as if someone, or something, was circling it. I gripped the flashlight tightly and stared at the door, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my effort to stay calm. The whispers stopped. Silence. And then, from the woods, "Emma!" I froze. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. It sounded like me. "Emma!" it called again. This time from the opposite side of the RV. I bolted the door and grabbed my camera, peeking through the small window. Shadows shifted among the trees, too quick to be the wind, but too fleeting to make out clearly. My trail camera's motion sensor blinked red, capturing something moving outside, but I couldn't bring myself to check the footage. For hours, I sat in silence, gripping my flashlight and staring at the door. The next day, I found the scratches. Long, deep gouges ran down the side of the RV as if something with claws had tried to tear its way in. I told myself it was probably a bear or a raccoon, though the marks were too precise, too deliberate. When I ventured into the woods to retrieve my trail camera, I found more unsettling signs. My scarf, which I'd left inside the RV, was hanging from a low branch. Nearby, my thermos sat upright in the dirt, though I hadn't brought it outside. Something was playing with me. That night, I resolved to stay awake and catch whatever, or whoever, was doing this. It was the baby's cry that drew me out. I had been sitting in the RV, camera in hand, when I heard it. Faint, desperate, and heart-wrenching. A baby crying in the woods. I knew better. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, to ignore it. But I couldn't. What if it was real? What if someone needed help? I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. "Hello," I called, my voice shaky. "Is someone out there?" The crying continued, leading me deeper into the forest. My flashlight flickered, but I kept going, following the sound to a small clearing. And there, by a dying fire, I saw it. A figure crouched low, its back turned to me. It was wearing my clothes, my jacket, my boots. Its hair was the same length and color as mine. "Hello?" I whispered, taking a cautious step forward. The figure straightened slowly, its movements unnatural, almost mechanical. When it turned, my stomach lurched. It was me, but not. Its face was twisted, its features elongated and wrong. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth stretched into a too-wide grin. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hand. The creature tilted its head and began to whisper. Words I couldn't understand, but somehow knew. My fears, my regrets, my secrets. I ran. The thing followed me back to camp, its whispers growing louder, more insistent. Inside the RV, I scrambled for anything I could use to defend myself. My camera, sitting on the counter, caught my eye. Skinwalkers hate being seen for what they truly are. Mike's words echoed in my mind. I grabbed the camera and turned on the flash. When the creature appeared at the window, I pressed the shutter. The flash illuminated its grotesque, twisted form, and it recoiled with a deafening screech. I didn't stop. I kept taking photos, the flash burning into its distorted body until it retreated into the woods. By dawn, the forest was silent again. I hiked to the ranger station, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Mike didn't say, "I told you so." He just listened, his face grim, and offered me a ride back to civilization. As I drove away, my RV rattling down the gravel road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. At the edge of the trees, a figure stood watching me, and I swear it was wearing my face. My name is Rachel Coleman. I'm 29 years old, a wildlife photographer, and I'm not the type to believe in ghost stories or urban legends. What I experienced last October at Yellow River State Forest in Iowa changed that forever. I was traveling solo in my RV, working on a photo essay called Forgotten Wild. The idea was to showcase remote, underappreciated natural areas and the wildlife that thrives there. My plan was simple: park the RV, set up trail cameras, and spend a few nights immersed in the forest. Yellow River was the perfect candidate, isolated, rugged, and teeming with wildlife. I arrived on a damp, overcast afternoon, the air thick with the smell of wet leaves and pine. The primitive campsite I chose was a mile from the nearest road, tucked between a creek and a dense patch of woods. Perfectly remote. I parked my RV, set up a small fire pit, and spent the rest of the day exploring the area. The trails were slippery from recent rain, and I nearly twisted my ankle climbing down a ravine to position a camera trap by the creek. Still, I was optimistic. The forest was alive with movement. Deer tracks crisscrossed the mud, owls hooted overhead, and I even spotted a flash of tawny fur in the distance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a chill crept in, and the forest seemed to exhale, its vibrant energy giving way to an eerie stillness. By the time I crawled into the RV for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. I checked my trail camera near the creek, hoping for a glimpse of the cougar rumored to roam the area. Instead, the memory card was wiped clean. Not a single photo. Frustrated, I blamed a malfunction and decided to test the camera overnight near my campsite. While repositioning the trap, I noticed something strange in the mud. A set of tracks, large and humanoid, with long, claw-like toes. They didn't look like anything I'd seen before, and I've studied animal tracks for years. My logical brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe a bear, distorted by the rain. That night, as I reviewed the day's photos in the RV, I heard it for the first time. A faint melody drifting through the trees. It was almost like humming, a low, mournful tune that rose and fell like a chant. I turned off the lights and peered out the window, my breath fogging the glass. The campsite was empty, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The song continued, growing louder, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the darkness. The beam cut through the mist, but nothing moved. The song stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the forest eerily quiet. The next day, I woke to another unsettling discovery. My RV's tires were slashed. Deep gouges ran through the rubber, the edges jagged and uneven. A chill ran down my spine as I inspected the damage. Nearby, a pile of animal bones, small, likely rabbits, lay in a crude circle, their placement deliberate. I felt a surge of panic. Was someone stalking me? A poacher, maybe? I tried to brush it off, focusing on repairing the tires with the spare patches I always carried. But my unease grew with every passing hour. By late afternoon, the rain returned, turning the trails into a muddy mess. Determined to salvage something from the trip, I hiked back to the camera trap near the creek. That's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the water, partially obscured by the trees, was a figure. Tall, thin, and unnaturally still. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its head bore a pair of antlers that jutted from its skull at impossible angles. My breath caught. The figure tilted its head toward me, its glowing yellow eyes piercing through the gloom. I stumbled backward, my camera falling into the mud. By the time I looked up again, it was gone. I returned to the RV in a panic, locking the doors and pulling the curtains shut. The forest outside felt alive, pulsating with an energy I couldn't explain. That night, the song returned. It started softly, just a whisper on the wind. But as the hours dragged on, it grew louder, filling the air with a haunting melody that seemed to seep into my bones. "Leave," I whispered to myself. "You need to leave." But when I stepped outside to check the RV, I realized it wasn't an option. The engine wouldn't start. The battery drained completely. The spare was missing, though I hadn't touched it since I arrived. I was trapped. The final night was a blur of terror. The song grew deafening, surrounding the RV in a cacophony of voices. Shadows flitted outside, too fast to track, their movements erratic and unnatural. Then came the pounding. Something slammed into the RV, rocking it violently. The windows rattled, and the walls groaned under the force of the blows. I clutched my hunting knife, heart racing, as the door handle jiggled. "Go away!" I screamed. The pounding stopped. For a moment, the forest was silent again. Then, a low, guttural voice whispered from just outside the door. "Rachel." My blood ran cold. Desperate, I grabbed the flare gun from my emergency kit and braced myself. If this thing wanted to come in, I wasn't going down without a fight. The door creaked open, and I fired the flare into the night. The light illuminated the creature in full, its gaunt frame towering over me, its antlers scraping the roof of the RV. Its face was hollow, more skull than flesh, with jagged teeth that glinted in the red glow. The flare hit its chest, igniting a burst of sparks. The creature let out a bone-chilling scream, a sound so unnatural it made my ears ring. It retreated into the forest, its glowing eyes lingering in the darkness before disappearing completely. At dawn, I limped out of the RV, exhausted and bleeding from a deep gash on my leg where the creature had swiped at me. Using every ounce of strength, I patched the RV enough to limp down the gravel road. I never looked back. It's been months since that night, but the memories haunt me. I never finished Forgotten Wild. The photos I took at Yellow River were blurry and distorted, as if the camera had captured something beyond human comprehension. I don't know what I encountered in those woods, but I do know one thing. Some wildernesses are better left alone. My name is George Whitaker. I'm 63 years old, a retired history teacher, and what I'm about to tell you happened in the spring of 2022. My wife, Margaret, had passed away 6 months earlier, and I had taken to traveling in our old RV to keep myself busy. My trips were part distraction, part project. I was gathering stories for a book about hauntings and forgotten legends in the Midwest. That's how I found myself at Wildcat Den State Park in Iowa. Nestled in a picturesque valley, the park was known for its rugged sandstone bluffs and the historic Pine Creek grist mill. But what drew me there wasn't the scenery. It was the story of Abigail Northcott. Abigail was a woman accused of witchcraft in the mid-1800s, long before Iowa became a state. As the story went, she was a healer and herbalist who lived alone near the mill. When a bad harvest and a string of illnesses struck the nearby settlers, they turned on her, accusing her of poisoning the land. She was hanged in secret, her body buried in an unmarked grave. Her curse, they said, hung over the area ever since. For someone like me, someone who thrives on history and mysteries, it was irresistible. I arrived on a Monday afternoon, the park nearly empty except for a few hikers. I parked my RV near the old grist mill, close enough to keep an eye on it, but far enough to avoid other visitors. The mill looked almost timeless, its wooden beams weathered but intact, standing defiantly against the years. I grabbed my camera and notebook and set out to explore, eager to uncover what stories the mill and its surroundings might hold. The trouble started almost immediately. I took a dozen photos of the mill, but when I reviewed them on my camera, every single image was blurred and distorted, as though something had moved through the frame. My first thought was a technical glitch. I'd had the camera for years, but when I tested it on a nearby tree, the photo came out sharp. It only failed when I pointed it at the mill. Frustrated but undeterred, I jotted down some notes and decided to hike the nearby trails. The sandstone bluffs and wooded paths were beautiful in the golden light of late afternoon, but the deeper I went, the quieter it became. Birds stopped chirping. Even the rustling of leaves seemed muted. That's when I found the carvings. At first they looked like random scratches on a tree trunk, but as I moved closer I saw they were symbols. Circles, crosses, and spirals that didn't resemble anything I'd seen before. Fresh, too, as though someone had carved them recently. I touched the bark, and a chill ran through my hand, sharp enough to make me pull back. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone nearby, but the woods were empty. By the time I returned to my RV, the sun was dipping below the horizon, and the park was cloaked in shadows. A knock startled me as I fumbled with the lock. I turned to see a woman in a ranger's uniform. She looked to be in her late 40s, with weathered skin and sharp eyes that scanned me as though measuring my intentions. "Evening," she said. "I'm Martha Hanson, one of the rangers here, just making my rounds." "Evening," I replied, still catching my breath. "Staying the night?" she asked, glancing at the RV. "Two, actually," I said. "I'm writing about the history of the area." Martha's expression tightened. "Well, stick to the main trails, and don't go poking around the mill after dark." I frowned. "Why not?" She hesitated, then said, "This place has a history. Some folks say it doesn't like being disturbed." Before I could press her, she tipped her hat and walked off into the growing darkness. That night, I woke to an unnatural chill. The RV's windows were frosted over, the temperature inside so cold I could see my breath. I checked my phone for the weather. It was supposed to be in the mid-50s. This made no sense. I climbed out of bed to grab an extra blanket when I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from the door. "Raccoons," I muttered, trying to convince myself. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, like claws raking across metal. I peeked out the window, expecting to see an animal, but the ground outside was empty, just the faint light of the moon casting long shadows across the clearing. I forced myself back to bed, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found scratches on the RV door. 3 parallel gouges ran down the metal, too large for any animal I could think of. I grabbed my notebook and sketched them out, noting the odd angle and depth of the marks. I spent the day near the mill, determined to gather more material for my book. I scoured the area for signs of Abigail's story, old plaques, inscriptions, anything, but found nothing concrete. As I was about to give up, I noticed something etched into the mill's foundation, partially hidden by moss. Scraping it away with a stick, I uncovered a faint inscription. She was no witch, but they killed her anyway. A shiver ran down my spine. That evening, the whispers began. They started faintly, just at the edge of hearing. At first, I thought it was the wind or distant hikers, but as the night wore on, they grew clearer. Voices, overlapping, speaking words I couldn't understand. I sat in the RV, clutching my notebook, when I saw movement outside. A figure stood near the mill, a woman in a tattered dress. Her back was to me, her long hair matted and swaying in the breeze. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers grew louder, almost urgent, as if pleading with me to act. I stepped outside, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Hello?" The woman turned. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken and filled with sorrow. She pointed a bony finger at me, then at the ground near the mill. "What do you want?" I whispered. She didn't speak. Instead, she faded into the darkness, leaving me alone in the freezing night. The final night was the worst. As I packed my things, determined to leave, the RV door slammed shut on its own, trapping me inside. The lights flickered, and a deafening roar filled my ears, like the sound of rushing wind and cracking timber. I collapsed to the floor, clutching my head, as images flooded my mind. Abigail, dragged from her home by an angry mob, her screams as they tied the noose around her neck. The villagers shouting accusations, their faces twisted with fear and hatred. And then, her curse. "I will not rest until the truth is known," she had screamed, her voice echoing in my skull. "You will all pay for what you've done." When I came to, the RV was silent. The air was warm again, the frost gone, but I knew I couldn't stay. I left Wildcat Den the next morning, shaken but determined. Over the next few weeks, I dove into local archives and unearthed records that confirmed Abigail's innocence. She hadn't poisoned anyone. The illnesses and crop failures were the result of a harsh winter and contaminated water, something she had tried to warn them about. Her story became the centerpiece of my book, a chapter dedicated to her life and wrongful death. Even now, as I write this, I feel her presence, watching, waiting, making sure I get it right. Some stories don't belong to the past. They linger, demanding to be heard. And some places like Wildcat Den will never let you forget.